So welcome everyone to our second screencast on the reproductive system. Here in part two, we're going to discuss the female reproductive system, and we'll start with the basic functional anatomy of the female reproductive system. So we begin with the ovaries. You may recall we kind of talked about these earlier. In the part one, the ovaries are the female reproductive organs, or the gonads. Remember, gonads is a term we use in general, whether we're not talking about necessarily male or female, but now the ovaries are the female reproductive organs, and they are the structures responsible for making the female gametes. Remember, gametes are reproductive cells. Excuse me, the female gametes are the ova or the eggs. But in addition to making the female gametes, the ova or the eggs, ovaries also manufacture two hormones, progesterone and estrogen. And we'll be talking about the importance of these, particularly whenever we get into the menstrual cycle. But in addition to the ovaries, just like with the male reproductive anatomy, just like with the testes, there was a duct system. Here in the female reproductive system, we're going to have a duct system as well. That system consists of the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, and those are, I apologize, those are the parts of the duct system. Now, the female reproductive anatomy can be looked at from the standpoint of the internal genitalia, and the internal genitalia then would consist of the ovaries and those internal ducts we just talked about. And then we can also look at the female reproductive system from, or anatomy from the standpoint of the external genitalia, which would include the external sex organs. So we'll be taking a look at those as well as we move along. Here's our overview picture showing each of the different components. We'll be breaking this down. This is a good diagram to make sure that you learn for the exam. So let's start with the primary reproductive organs in the females, the ovaries. Remember, they produce the gametes and also produce the hormones. The ovaries are paired organs on either side of the uterus, and they are held in place by several ligaments. So unlike the testicles, the ovaries are inside the body wall, not outside the body wall. What ligaments hold the ovaries in place? First, we look at the ovarian ligament. This is a ligament that anchors the ovary medially to the uterus. Remember, medial means toward the inside. In addition, there is a suspensory ligament. The suspensory ligament anchors the ovary laterally to the pelvic wall itself. And then finally, we have the mesovarium. The mesovarium is a thin ligament that suspends the ovary between the uterus and the pelvic wall. Now, in the next diagram I'm going to show you, I want to put this up because it doesn't mention the mesovarium. It mentions something called the broad ligament. The broad ligament is a ligament that contains both the suspensory ligament and the mesovarium. So on the next slide, while the suspensory ligament is shown, the mesovarium is not. It's just labeled as the broad ligament. But remember, the broad ligament is composed of both the sensory or suspensory ligament and the mesovarium. So here's that diagram I was talking about. And here we can see the ovary here on this side and the left ovary on this side. We take a look at this side because we're showing those ligaments. And so we can see here's our ligament that attaches the ovary medially to the uterus. That's the ovarian ligament. Here's the ligament right here, which has a sheath over it. And inside that ligament, there are blood vessels. So those blood vessels are inside that sheath, but that's going to attach to the body wall out here, and it's going to continue behind this fallopian tube and attach to the ovary. Now, you can see this thin structure that surrounds the ovary kind of on all sides. It's very broad and thin. This is the broad ligament. Now, this portion of the broad ligament that's thin like this would be the mesovarium, and the suspensory ligament would be up here, and you can see how that sheath kind of expands to form the mesovarium then. So the suspensory ligament plus the mesovarium equals the broad ligament. Okay, we'll be back to this diagram several times as we move along. Continuing on with the ovaries, if we take a look at the ovaries in cross-section, we will see sac-like structures that are embedded in the outer region of the ovary just underneath the capsule. These sac-like structures are referred to as follicles. Each one of these follicles consists of an immature egg, which we refer to as an oocyte, and that immature egg is surrounded by supportive cells. These supportive cells are called follicle cells when there's only a single layer of the cells present, or follicular cells. But as the follicles develop, we'll see as we move along here, and they mature, what will happen is the follicle cells will divide and begin to form several layers. When several layers of follicle cells are present in the follicle, they're no longer referred to as follicle or follicular cells. They are now referred to as granulosa cells. All right, so here is a cross-section of the female ovary, the artist's conception of it. And what we see here is follicles that are in in different stages of development. Now, this is taking a single follicle through several stages of development, but there are literally hundreds or thousands of these follicles that are developing inside the ovary, and they develop on cue during the ovarian cycle, which we'll be taking a look at. We start out here, this says primary follicle. This would actually kind of be a primordial follicle that we'll talk about in the next slide. But this follicle, here we can see the primary oocyte, and around it we can see a single layer of cells. So this would be a primordial follicle. Now what will happen is the cells will start to multiply and divide, and layers of cells will start to form around the oocyte, and the oocyte will increase in cytoplasm, so it'll increase in size. And as it begins to develop, now this would be what we would refer to as a primary follicle. Now what happens is this follicle continues to grow as more and more now granulosal cells are form, and remember these are the supportive cells, and it continues to enlarge, and we begin to see a kind of a cavity or an opening that develops between the layers of cells. This opening is referred to as the antrum, and eventually what happens is that antrum will become fluid filled. So this will all be filled with fluid. Now you can see the many layers of granulosa cells here, and we still see our primary oocyte. This structure with the antrum, fluid-filled space, the multiple layers of follicles or follicular cells, the granulosal cells, I should say now, this is referred to now as a Graafian follicle. So this is a mature follicle that forms. This is the one that's going to rupture during the menstrual cycle, during the end of the menstrual cycle, and release an egg, and we'll be taking a look at that. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We'll get to some of the other structures there in just a minute, but moving on into the next slide. So as we just kind of mentioned there with the follicles, there are different types of follicles, but the differences in types only represents what stage of development the follicle is in. So we have a primordial follicle, as I mentioned in the previous slide, in which there's a single layer of follicle cells that surround the oocyte. Then we have a primary follicle, the second one that we looked at. There's two or more layers now. Notice we're not using the term follicle cells anymore, but we're using granulosal cells. Once we have more than one layer, They're now referred to as granulosal cells, not follicle cells. But these cells, as they develop, continue to surround the oocyte. The next type of follicle we have is called a secondary follicle. That secondary follicle contains a fluid-filled space that develops, which is referred to as the antrum. And the final stage of development and the final type of follicle then that we see inside the ovary is a Graafian follicle. This is a mature follicle. It's so filled with fluid that it'll begin to bulge at the surface of the ovary. And if we were to take a look at an ovary with a mature Graafian follicle using a fiber optic camera, we could actually see how the Graafian follicle causes the ovary to bulge at its surface. But this mature follicle, which will eventually rupture to release an egg during ovulation, is referred to as a Graafian follicle. Now, these follicles undergo development through what is referred to as the ovarian cycle. And for legal reasons, I guess, I'm not going to show the ovarian cycle here in this screencast, but you can find the ovarian cycle, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it under videos and other animations. So take some time to look at that and understand what's going on here in the development of those follicles. Okay, so we said the Graafian follicle will eventually rupture to release the oocyte from the ovary. This process is referred to as ovulation. So ovulation is the release or ejection of the oocyte from the Graafian follicle. Ovulation occurs about once every 28 days. And as all of the females in the class know, that's not an exact science. It happens right on the 28th day. It can be give or take, and there are different things that can affect ovulation, like stress, maybe from a class that you're taking, or exercise, weight, so on and so forth. Even the other women around you can affect when ovulation is going to occur. As we see oftentimes in college dormitories, where by the end of the year, a lot of the women may begin to ovulate at approximately the same time. And we're not really sure exactly why that happens, but there is some good science behind that showing that does often occur. Okay, so one of the other structures that we didn't mention there was a structure called the corpus luteum. So after the Graafian follicle ruptures, it then becomes a gland that can secrete hormones. And this gland is called the corpus luteum. It actually means, corpus means body, and luteum means yellow. So this is a kind of a yellow body or gland that remains behind. It secretes estrogen and progesterone, the two female hormones. And these hormones are necessary to establish and maintain pregnancy if a fertilization occurs. However, if a fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum then will degenerate. It will stop secreting the hormones, and that will have physiologic effects that we'll take a look at as we look at the ovarian and the menstrual cycles. So this happens if the egg is not fertilized. So you can go back a couple of screens and take a look then. That's, we didn't discuss that at the time, but you can see the corpus luteum, and you can see how it degenerates if an egg isn't fertilized. Okay, now let's move from the ovaries onto the duct system, and the first component of the duct system we'll take a look at is the uterine or the fallopian tubes. So once ovulation occurs, what happens to that primary oocyte? The oocyte, once ovulated, is going to be then transported into the fallopian tubes. So it's going to be received by the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes then are going to provide a site for fertilization. So if fertilization is going to occur, it's going to occur in the uterine or fallopian tubes. If fertilization does not occur in the fallopian tubes, that would be referred to as an ectopic pregnancy or ectopic fertilization. And if the fertilization occurs outside the uterine tubes, that egg, which would develop, would be doomed, and it could affect the health and even to some extent the life of the female if that ectopic pregnancy occurs. The uterine or fallopian tubes then will transport the fertilized egg, if it is fertilized, into the uterus, and the fertilized egg, then now called a zygote, will attach to the uterus. The fertilized egg, the zygote, will start to develop. It'll become, if you recall, maybe from A&P1 you discussed this, it'll become like a berry-like cluster of cells called a morula, and then that morula will go on to develop an internal opening and is then referred to as a blastocyst. And that blastocyst then is what is going to implant or attach to the uterine wall. If this takes place in the uterus, as I said, and should not take place in the fallopian tubes, if it were to take place in the fallopian tubes, that would be an ectopic pregnancy. The uterine and fallopian tubes, again, are just like the ovaries, supported by the broad ligament. What are the functions then of the uterine or fallopian tubes? Well, at the ends of the fallopian tubes, there are like finger-like projections, and these finger-like projections kind of beat back and forth, kind of like my fingers are doing right now. And they're located at the distal end of the fallopian tube. So when the egg is ovulated, the egg is going to move toward those fimbriae are going to beat back and forth. That's going to create currents that's going to draw that egg, or that oocyte, I guess I should say, into the fallopian tube. So these finger-like projections at the distal end will receive the oocyte. Now, lining the inside wall of the fimbriae, and for that matter the uterine tubes, are ciliated cells. These cells inside the uterine tube will kind of beat to create currents excuse me, that will slowly move the oocyte once it enters the tube toward the uterus. And this is going to take about 3 to 4 days. So what happens here, if you take a look at my hand, what happens is the cilia will beat like this, rotate around, stick back up, beat, rotate around, stick back up, and they'll do this, and that'll create a current that will, let's say, draw the, I guess I goes backwards, draw the fluid across the inner surface, the lumen of the fallopian tube, and that will draw the oocyte through the fallopian tube. And again, if fertilization is going to occur, it should occur inside the uterine tube. If not, the pregnancy would be kind of doomed and not be a good pregnancy. Okay. Next up, let's move to the uterus. The uterus is located behind, or excuse me, between the urinary bladder and the rectum. So it's kind of underneath the urinary bladder, but over top of the rectum. The uterus is a hollow organ. Unlike cats, which you've seen in the dissection of the reproductive anatomy of the female cat, the human uterus is a pear-shaped organ, whereas remember in the cat it's oftentimes referred to as a bicornuate because there was a body and then that body gave off two long extensions, and these were called the uterine horns, not to be confused with the fallopian tubes in the cat. So the reason for these horns, I think they indicated that in the dissection, in cats is so that they have litters of kittens. So they can have 3, 4, or 5 kittens at any pregnancy. Humans generally have 1 or maybe 2. Humans, the uterus is kind of pear-shaped. Now the uterus is going to receive, as we said, the fertilized egg, because the fertilization is going to occur. It's going to occur in the fallopian tubes. Once the fertilized egg now enters the uterus, it'll be retained in the uterus. The egg will undergo implantation. It'll attach to the inner uterine wall, and then blood vessels in that inner uterine wall, the endometrium, will provide nourishment for that fertilized egg as it now undergoes stages of development. So to our diagram here, we're looking at here on this artist conception. I like this. They actually it does kind of look like a hand, doesn't it? Covering over the ovary here. But you can see these finger-like projections. These are the fimbriae that are noted here on this side. This first part of the uterine or fallopian tube is referred to as the infundibulum. It means stalk. And then the uterine tube extends all the way here to the uterus. And again, here's the pear-shaped uterus as we take a look at it. Okay, we'll get into more structure on the uterus as we move along. As a matter of fact, let's do that now. So we take a look at the regions of the uterus. The first region is the body. That's the main portion of the uterus. Next up, we have the fundus. This is the area where the uterine tubes enter, and the fundus is usually a dome-shaped region. Remember, the fundus of the stomach was the dome-shaped part of the cardiac region of the stomach. And then at the opposite end of the fundus, inferior to the fundus, we have a narrow outlet that will protrude into the vaginal canal below, and that outlet from the uterus is referred to as the cervix. Let's take a look at the walls of the uterus. The inner uterus, I should say, is divided, has 3 layers to it. Go figure. Just about everything we're taking a look at the walls has 3 layers, doesn't it? The first layer, we'll start with the innermost layer. The innermost layer is referred to as endometrium. The endometrium is what allows for implantation or attachment of a fertilized egg. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time to go over implantation and how it works, but it's a pretty interesting process. And so I put up this link to Arizona State University webpage where they talk in more detail about how implantation occurs. It's pretty interesting. If you don't have time to get it from here, write it down. I did post the link under on Canvas, and it is under Extending Your Knowledge, and it's the last link down under Extending Your Knowledge. So take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. Okay, the endometrium will slough off if no pregnancy occurs, and that's what occurs in menses. So at the end of the menstrual cycle, we'll be talking about that. Now, when we say it sloughs off, I don't want you to think that it gets completely eliminated, but what happens is in preparation for pregnancy, it becomes thickened. Well, that thickness gets reduced back down again if pregnancy does not occur. And that's what we mean by sloughing off. The middle layer of the uterine wall is called the myometrium. And you may recall when we talk about muscles, myo comes from Latin meaning muscle. So this is the muscular layer. It's the middle layer, and it's composed of smooth muscle tissue. And then there's an outer layer. This outer layer is a serous layer. It's made up of a serous membrane. Remember, serous membranes have 2 layers to them. And one layer adheres right to the surface of the organ. This would be called the visceral layer. And we're in the abdominopelvic region, so this would be the visceral peritoneum. And then that's going to fold back to attach to the body wall, and that would be the parietal peritoneum. But the serous layer, or the outer layer of the wall of the uterus, is made uterus is made up of that visceral peritoneum. Okay, moving ahead to the vagina then is going to extend from the cervix to the exterior of the body. It's going to be located behind the bladder, but in front of the rectum, just as the uterus is. The vagina is going to serve as the birth canal. It will also receive the penis during sexual intercourse. Associated with the vagina, there is a very thin, delicate membrane called the hymen. The hymen partially closes the vagina until it is ruptured. It's very delicate. There's, an old misconception out there that if the hymen is missing or it has been ruptured, that the female must have had intercourse. That's not true. It's very delicate. And particularly these days with women involved in sports, it can rupture as a result of sports. It can rupture as a result of physical examination, let's say by a physician. There are a lot of different reasons why it can rupture. Again, it's a very, very delicate membrane. But associated with that rupture, oftentimes there will be a little bit of spotting of blood or just a little bit of bleeding, which would be natural. So again, here we're taking a look at our pear-shaped uterus. Here we can see the dome-shaped fundus of the uterus. This would be the midsection of the body of the uterus. And down here, this would be the cervix. And you can see how the cervix kind of protrudes down into this vaginal canal, the vagina down here. Here are the walls of the uterus. First, we have the innermost wall, the endometrium. We notice the endometrium is very thin, so it hasn't kind of gotten really plush and thickened in preparation for a pregnancy. Next that, we move to the outer portion. This outer portion then is the myometrium, the muscular middle layer. And then we have the perimetrium, or the serous layer, out here. And that would be the third component of the wall of the uterus. Okay. Next up, that was the internal genitalia. Let's take a look now at the female external genitalia. The external genitalia is referred to as the vulva. The vulva, or external genitalia, consists, first of all, of the mons pubis. The mons pubis is this fatty area that kind of has a dome shape to it that overlies the pubic symphysis. Remember, that's the joint where the two pubic bones meet one another anteriorly. The mons pubis is covered with pubic hair after puberty. And our next structure we have are the labia. These are two sets of folds of skin. You have the labia majora first, and this is the larger fold of skin. We can see this outer larger fold of skin, the labia majora. And then inside we have, more medially and more recessed, we have the labia minora, the thinner folds of skin. Next up, we have the vestibule. This is a recessed area that it's enclosed by the labia majora. So this entire recessed area inside the labia majora is referred to as the vestibule. It contains, as we can see here, the urethral orifice, and it contains also the greater vestibular glands, and these glands produce mucus. And mucus provides for lubrication. The next structure we have is the clitoris. The clitoris is a small protruding structure that is composed largely of erectile tissue. So just like with the penis, it has vascular spaces in it that can become the vasculature can become engorged with blood, and that can cause a firmness or kind of an erection of the clitoris. The clitoris itself is hooded by a skin fold, which is called the prepuce, and that is formed by the junction of the labia minora. So you can see where the labia minora come together here. There's the clitoris, and there's the hood of skin over the clitoris, which is referred to as the prepuce. Okay, so now that we have the basic functional anatomy of the female reproductive system down, let's go on to take a look at egg formation and development. This is referred to as oogenesis. So oogenesis is the sequence of events that results in the production of a mature egg or ova. This is occurring in the developing follicles, as we've seen in prior slides. The total supply of eggs, by the way, is going to be present at birth. So oogenesis occurs entirely before the female is born, during the fetal stage. Once she's born, stem cells now no longer can give rise they kind of degenerate and can no longer give rise to any more primary oocytes. Oogenesis will continue, though once the eggs are present, oogenesis can continue at puberty. The reproductive ability of the female then will end at menopause, which is defined as the end of reproductive life. So unlike males, once they start producing sperm at puberty, they'll produce sperm for the entirety of their life. Females will produce their full complement of eggs by the time they're born. Those eggs may undergo development. That development starts at puberty, but there is only a certain limited number of eggs, and a female will have an end to their reproductive life, and that's referred to as menopause. So with oogenesis, we begin with stem cells. Remember, the stem cells in sperm production were called spermatogonia. The stem cells in ova production or egg production are called oogonia. These are the female stem cells that are found in the developing fetus. Oogonia will undergo mitosis to produce primary oocytes. The primary oocytes then, as we've seen, will be surrounded by follicle cells. That forms a primordial and then ultimately a primary follicle in the ovary, as we've seen. So if you have a single layer of cells, it's called primordial follicle. You have two layers of cells, it's referred to as a primary follicle. And as we've mentioned, the oogonia will degenerate, undergo apoptosis, and they will no longer exist by the time the female is born. The primary oocytes now will be inactive once they form by mitotic divisions. They'll be inactive until the female reaches puberty, the beginning of her sexual life. During this time, a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, will cause, as you've seen if you've looked at the ovarian cycle animation, will cause a number of primary follicles to begin to mature. One of those primary follicles will eventually go on to become the Graafian follicle. But while the primary follicles are developing, meiosis will start, once they develop, I should say, into the Graafian follicle, meiosis will start inside the maturing follicle. So if you're not recalling, go back to meiosis. Remember, that's that two-stage reduction division that reduces the chromosome number in the gametes or the reproductive cells. So meiosis starts inside the maturing follicle. We go through the first part of meiosis, meiosis 1. This reduces the chromosome number, and when the chromosome number is reduced from 2n to n, the result is called a secondary oocyte. Now, at this time, a cytoplasmic division will occur as well. So in this cytoplasmic division, we get a secondary oocyte with the n number of chromosomes, and we get what is called a polar body, which will also have the n number of chromosomes. Now, what will happen is meiosis will be arrested at the end of part 1 that produces this secondary oocyte in a polar body, and it won't resume until after ovulation and only if fertilization takes place. In other words, a sperm cell penetrates the egg. If a sperm cell penetrates the egg or the ovum, the second phase of meiosis, meiosis 2, will occur. At that time, 2 additional polar bodies will be produced, but we'll still only have a single mature ovum now. So to follow that diagrammatically, if we take a look at it here, so we have this chart divided before birth, during the fetal stage, during childhood, and then beginning at puberty. So before birth, we have these stem cells called oogonial cells. They will undergo mitotic divisions. Remember, mitosis will not reduce the chromosome number. So notice that when these mitotic divisions occur, the chromosome number remains 2n. There's still a full set of chromosomes. For humans, that would be what? 46 chromosomes, or 2 sets of 23, right? 2n, 2 sets of 23. So when this oogonium undergoes mitosis, this results in the formation of a primary oocyte, which then becomes encapsulated inside this follicle. So this would be a primary, or this might be a primordial follicle. The oocyte now will begin to grow. It'll begin to get larger. And now it will be arrested in prophase 1 at birth. And so now here's our primary oocyte. And now we can see the follicle is maturing. So we might say, even though it shows like a single layer, this might be 2 layers of cells. We'd call it a primary follicle. Okay, so now this primary oocyte is going to be arrested in prophase 1, and these primary oocytes will be present inside the ovaries at birth. Okay, prior to puberty, during childhood, the ovary will be inactive, and these follicles will not develop any further. Each month from puberty to menopause, now, what we're going to see is that primary oocyte still arrested in prophase 1 inside the follicle, but now the follicles will be stimulated to begin maturing until we reach a mature Graafian or vesicular follicle that still contains the primary oocyte. Okay, now, at this time, while this is maturing in the Graafian follicle, what will happen? Meiosis 1 will now be completed by one of the primary oocytes in the Graafian follicle each month. Sometimes 2 in the case of, let's say, fraternal twins. Okay? Now, as a result of the first meiotic division, what's going to happen? Remember, the first meiotic division is going to reduce the chromosome number by half. So what we're going to get as a result of this first meiotic division is one large secondary oocyte, and the secondary oocyte here, even though it's marked, is going to have the n number of chromosomes. It's going to now have half set of chromosomes. Again, you can go back to the meiosis slide to take a look at how that chromosome number gets cut in half. It's the same for the egg cells as it is for the sperm. But the difference is now from sperm to egg is that notice that one of these 2 cells, as a result of the first meiotic division, receives almost all of the cytoplasm. That one becomes the secondary oocyte, while the other cell, that's the result of this first meiotic division, receives almost no cytoplasm. This becomes a first polar body. So basically all it is the genetic material, the chromosomes, but very, very little cytoplasm. So because this one gets all the cytoplasm, it has a workforce that this one does not have. So this one can go on and continue to develop. This one may die, or it may go on to undergo the second meiotic division, but ultimately, because it has no workforce, the cell is going to degenerate and die. So let's follow this secondary oocyte. Now what's going to happen is the secondary oocyte now will be arrested in metaphase 2. Remember, that's when the chromosomes line up at the equator or the center of the cell. This secondary oocyte is what is going to be ovulated here when the Graafian follicle ruptures, and it will be released from the ovary, be received by the fimbriae, and enter into the uterine or fallopian tubes. Once it enters the fallopian tube, now this is where it's possible for sperm cells to fertilize the egg, join with the egg, and if a sperm cell joins with the egg, the second meiotic division will be completed, and that will form a mature ovum or egg and another polar body. Now, eventually, again, these polar bodies don't have, very much cytoplasm, so they're all going to degenerate. And this ovum now, once fertilized by the egg, will go on to form the zygote, the first cell of the new individual, and that zygote will begin to multiply, divide, go through the early stages of development, and ultimately form a fetus. Okay, now, next up, let's take a look at the menstrual cycle. And I have in parentheses uterine cycle because we're going to you can look at the menstrual cycle separate from the uterine cycle. You can look at the uterine cycle separate from the menstrual cycle, or you can look at the two of them combined. We're kind of going to take a look at the two of them combined in this discussion here. So the menstrual cycle is the cycle that results in the thickening and degeneration and discharge, ultimately, of the endometrium. The menstrual cycle is divided into 4 phases whenever we include the uterine cycle embedded within it. 3 phases if we're not talking about the uterine cycle. But the menstrual cycle, the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle are the follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, the luteal phase, and the menstrual phase. So our goal here is going to be to take a look at the events that occur within each one of these 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, with the uterine cycle embedded. So the first phase is the follicular phase. The follicular phase begins when the level of follicle-stimulating hormone surges. This happens during puberty. So first menstrual cycle will occur at puberty when the level of follicle-stimulating hormone surges. Follicle-stimulating hormone then will stimulate groups of primary follicles to begin to grow. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates primary follicles to begin to grow. Eventually mostly one, or sometimes 2 of the follicles will assume dominance, and those follicles that assume dominance will begin to secrete estrogen. So what will happen is estrogen levels will begin to increase. These high estrogen levels will stimulate the pituitary gland to increase its production of another hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH. With the increase in luteinizing hormone, that ends the follicular phase and takes us on to the ovulatory phase. So the ovulatory phase begins when the level of luteinizing hormone begins to surge. As a result, the Graafian follicle now will rupture, and the oocyte will be released from the ovary. We say in general the egg. Now what will happen? Remember, those fimbriae kind of beat back and forth, and the cilia inside them, and they sweep the egg into the fallopian tube. Here now, estrogen will at this time also cause cervical mucus to begin to thin in preparation to receive sperm. So this is one of the reasons for the natural family planning and how the female can determine whether or not she is likely to become pregnant, because if that mucus thins out and becomes very stringy, that's an indication that we're in the ovulatory phase and ovulation has occurred, and the likelihood of becoming pregnant increases dramatically. But now that takes us on to the luteal phase. The luteal phase begins immediately after ovulation. So once that egg is ovulated, we are now in the luteal phase, because think of what we have. The Graafian follicle ruptures, that leaves a gland behind called what? The corpus luteum, the yellow body. So the ruptured follicle now becomes a functional gland, the corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum begins to secrete now progesterone. Once the progesterone is released, it stimulates a thickening of the endometrium. So this is what causes the endometrium to become much thicker and much more plush. And that happens because now, it makes sense, the egg has been ovulated, there's a potential for a fertilization to occur, and if a fertilization does occur, we want that egg, that newly fertilized egg, to be able to implant or attach to the endometrium. The egg cannot attach to the endometrium unless it is in this thick, plush stage. Once inside the uterus, then, the embryo will implant by the 20th day of the menstrual cycle. So if the egg is, in fact, now I say egg, but it's actually a blastocyst at this point. But if the blastocyst, if the egg is fertilized and forms a blastocyst, by the 20th day now, it will have traveled into the uterus and it will attach to the endometrium, the inner wall, the thick, plush inner wall of the uterus. That takes us to the menstrual phase. So if no fertilization occurs, the ovum will pass through the uterus and the corpus luteum will cease to function. So progesterone production will drop off, estrogen production will drop off very sharply if fertilization doesn't occur. And this will occur by about day 26 of the cycle. As a result, the endometrium, these hormones are necessary to support the thick plushness of the endometrium. If a fertilization hasn't occurred, there's no reason for the endometrium to remain thick and plush and able to attach the developing embryo. So with the decrease in hormones, nothing there to support that, the endometrium will begin to break down and it will begin to slough off. This results in menses, this endometrial sloughing accompanied by blood flow, because blood vessels are going to be rupturing as well during this time. And that endometrial sloughing and the blood flow that comes from the breakdown of the blood vessels is menstruation or menses. This usually begins on about the 28th day of the cycle. And that's why this is referred to as the menstrual phase. Now, if a fertilization does occur, the menstrual phase doesn't occur because the corpus luteum remains active to maintain the endometrium for the developing embryo. But if the menstrual phase does occur, it's going to begin on about day 28, and it usually lasts for 3 to 5 days. And there are many things that can have a big effect on that as well. So here then is just a slide that shows the uterine and ovarian cycles together. We've taken a look at it as the menstrual cycle, so it's like both of these things happening at the same time. But if we take a look at just the uterine cycle, what's happening to just the uterine during this 28, or the uterus during this 28-day cycle, we have a menstrual phase in which the endometrium is sloughing off. Then at about day 5, there's this proliferative phase where the endometrium is becoming thicker. And then we have the secretory phase in which the hormones are being secreted. And then if fertilization doesn't occur, we return to the sloughing off at about day 28. With the ovarian cycle, as you've seen, we start out with that primary follicle becoming a vesicular follicle, which is the Graafian follicle, right? And then, so during this stage, while the primary follicle is maturing to become a vesicular or Graafian follicle, this is called the follicular phase. And then the ovulation occurs, the Graafian follicle ruptures and releases the primary oocyte. And then that takes us on to the luteal phase, where we have the presence of the corpus luteum, the yellow body, and maintaining that as a hormone-producing gland. Eventually, if no fertilization occurs, it will degenerate. But don't let this slide confuse you between the menstrual cycle and the two cycles together, okay? What you should mainly know is the events of the menstrual cycle and what's happening there, because that kind of puts everything together. Okay, we'll kind of wrap things up here on the female reproductive anatomy just by talking about some associated terms that you should be familiar with. The first term is menarche. Menarche is the initial menstrual period. So the first period the female has at puberty is called menarche. This can start as early as 9 or as late as 17, though these days it seems to be occurring earlier and earlier. But the average is somewhere around 12.5 for that initial menstrual period. It's around 12.5. Generally, it's between 12 and 15, but again, the average is around 12.5. Menopause, we've been talking about this. Menopause is defined as the cessation of menses for the remainder of a woman's lifetime. So no more menstruation at menopause, but along with that, no more ability to become pregnant as well, because you're not ovulating eggs anymore. Now, another term that's closely associated with and sometimes used as a synonym with menopause, but it's actually not, is the term climacteric. Climacteric is defined as the period of time that marks the end of the woman's reproductive life, and that ends with menopause. So climacteric is the time whenever, as many females know, this is the time whenever cycle is coming to a close. It's characterized by a lot of different things, hot flashes, because hormones are kind of up and down and changing very rapidly. Irregular periods. There's even some other characteristics that we can take a look at here. Here are some of them. Common signs that climacteric is beginning. Menstrual irregularities, hot flashes, unusual perspiration, irritability, sleep disorders, depression, vaginal dryness, you name it, they're all there. So this is a time whenever we're coming down to the end of the reproductive life. Hasn't ended yet, but we're getting there. When the menses actually ends, excuse me, then the female is in menopause. She's not in menopause until menses actually stops. That time prior to that is called climacteric. Another associated term is amenorrhea. Anytime you see a used as a prefix at the beginning of a term, it means without. So menorrhea, rhea, discharge. The discharge that occurs with the sloughing off and the blood is menses. So amenorrhea, the absence of menses. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the reproductive system. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you've enjoyed the class, and we'll see you for our last exam.